almost done, folks. Thanks for hanging in there. We are just this session and the rollout of the survey. And, you know, it says in the, by the way, at the end of this program, it's like, I'm going to use a half an hour to wrap up. I guarantee you I will not do that. I'm going to spare you of any of that. I think you can wrap it up for yourselves after that. I want to start by introducing Teresa Jordan, who's in education leadership. And just to say, we wanted this, especially in this event today, education this is, because of how important this is as a priority in the country and in this state especially, because Nevada has been a state that has systematically underfunded its education, and it's facing the consequences for that policy. And so we want to make sure that any political discussion includes the practical reality of what is the viability of public support, what is the opportunity to reform and to reinvest in education. So with that, I give you Teresa.
Thank you, Rob. I was really excited at the prospect of being able to do this. Am I okay?
No, I think it's because you have both mics on. I think you have that mic and your mic.
So how do I? Oh, I'm so technologically challenged. How do I turn this mic off?
I think there's a little switch. No, they took it off. They should be able to do that up there.
All
They
right.
took off the other monitor.
Is it better if I stand over here? No. Thank you. I was really excited about being invited to speak on this topic in this venue because I think the region has a unique opportunity as we explore education policy issues. I think one of the positive outcomes of the economic crisis is that it forces us to sort of leave our comfort zone and examine things from a unique perspective, if only because of economic necessity. It provides state policymakers an opportunity to consider where we as a region relative to educational policy are and to discuss new and innovative ways of creating educational institutions that actually fit what we know, what we're able to do, and what we can afford. We know that the current perceptions of schooling are not always positive, and we've seen a decline in educational productivity outcomes over the last decade. Yet our views of real school are so firmly entrenched that reform seems to be like a daunting task. Everybody knows what to do about education because we've all experienced it. We know what math instruction is supposed to look like because our 6th grade math teacher taught us. And so it's very difficult to move forward and look at things in completely new and unique ways. Yet education institutions, for the most part, are contingent institutions. So there are many feasible alternatives. How we think about the potential alternatives with our firmly entrenched and accepted values, beliefs, rules, and norms around schooling is the challenge. The purpose of this presentation today, okay. Thanks. The purpose of the presentation today is to provide you with some comparative baseline education data or demographics, and I know you're swimming in demographics, but this is from a little different perspective for the 6 states in the region. And then I'm going to discuss the current state funding allocation systems and then look to future policy challenges. So are we making progress? The root of the matter is that public school systems in the United States is not adequately efficient as an education force for reasons of administration, indifference of parents and kids, lack of motivation and instruction, and because we're in hard economic times. The public school system does not reach and hold all of its children. Now, that could be said today, but that was found in a journal by one of my colleagues in 1910. So are we making progress? I think we are. It's just that at each, and it's from this perspective, each generation looks at their system in their context. And the challenge for educators is that we are always preparing individuals for a social and political and economic reality that don't yet exist. So we really, in some ways, need to be futurists. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about demographics. I'm going to look at a set of inputs. There are many more educational inputs than these, but I'm going to look at student enrollment, ethnicity, special needs children, and average teacher salaries, primarily because these things significantly impact the funding levels or costs of education, and then looking at outputs or productivity measures, graduation rates, dropout rates, and student achievement. So the first thing is inputs. This is a table that shows you the student enrollment for the region. So we have approximately 3.4 million students in the region. We have Arizona with the largest student population, followed by Colorado. We have a myriad of district configurations, and I put this up here because districts, for the most part, are political entities that are idiosyncratic to their context. In other words, they bear no rhyme or reason to costing or efficiency, or they've evolved over time. Some have evolved because of legislative inaction, of legislation enactments. Some have evolved just because of the reality of geographical boundaries. There's a mountain in the way. The kids can't get over the mountain to get to school, kind of thing. So Arizona has the largest number of school districts with 608. They have a fairly complex structure. They have many different kinds of districts. They have elementary districts, high school districts, unified districts. They have districts that have no children. And so it's a very interesting political makeup of school boards in Arizona. The least number of districts is Nevada, because in 1967, in 1954, the legislature enacted county coterminous districts. And so prior to that, we had about, at one time we had a little over 300 school districts in Nevada. Then right before the enactment, we were down to about 200 plus. And so now we went overnight from 200 plus to 17. So that must have been a fairly traumatic change process for educational institutions in the state at that time. Student enrollment in the schools represents about 7.4 of the total population, so we're a small percentage of school-age children in the population of the country. The most recent data available is 2009, and it shows that 31.2% of children live in Arizona, 24% of the region is Colorado, and then the rest are distributed across. So about half of the kids are either in Arizona or in Colorado. The region has a diverse range of ethnicity. The distribution of ethnic subgroups varies across the region. The least diverse state in student population is Idaho, with 17.7% of the student population diverse, followed by Utah. And then 3 states, New Mexico, Nevada, and Arizona, are majority minority in terms of their student population. New Mexico's student population is 69.4% diverse. Nevada's student population is 55.7%, and Arizona is 54.6%. Diversity can be a predictor for school districts for planning curriculum development and instructional delivery strategies to be able to meet the needs of all children. For example, the quality of English language learning programs for those students in need of services can have a profound effect on the student achievement outcomes of a school district. These are the ethnicity distributions for the states. And if you look at New Mexico, New Mexico's student population is 54.6% Hispanic. And then they have one of the larger American Indian populations because they have several Indian reservations within their boundaries. This is the population distribution for children with special needs. So you can see here the number of children at risk, and this is basically the number of children in poverty, and in school districts they use children that qualify for free and reduced price lunch as the proxy. The number of limited English speaking or English language learner children, and then the number of children with IEPs or who receive special education services. Then on the far right column, you can see the total enrollment of these special needs. But these are double counts, so this will project total service numbers, but it gives you a feel for the magnitude of special education issues that districts have to, or states have to deal with. So for example, the double counts come from a child could be on an IEP as a special education child, but also be an English language learner as well. Or a child can be in poverty and also be in an ELL program. This sort of is just looking at the same proportional information. On the left-hand side, this is the state's percentage share in the region for special education needs. And then on the right, it shows the state's need of total enrollment. And remember, that is a double count for some children. So it's a slightly overinflated total percentage. But if you look at the percentages across the state, you can see states such as Arizona and New Mexico and Nevada have quite extensive special service needs. And that will go to policy decisions for how a state determines how they fund. And there's a concept called vertical equity, which is the principal equity. There's horizontal equity, which basically is treating equal people in equal circumstances the same. And vertical equity realizes that children are different and have differentiated needs, and that there may be attached differentiated cost to those needs. So if you look in states, again, like Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico, and particularly New Mexico, where the majority of their population is in need of some type of special support service because of their large Native American population that have EL issues as well as the Hispanic population there, then this is going to be a stressor in a state that does not deal with vertical equity in their funding formula, and we'll see more about that later. Another input variable is teacher salaries, because that is the largest single cost for the operation of school districts. And so if you look at this chart, you can see that, that we have not done too badly in salaries. We made some gains from 07 and 08, but relative to the US average. And part of that was because early on, right before this, the Rust Belt states, if you will, were going through great economic downturn, and so that was causing stressors on school districts, and we did not really realize those problems. And so you can see that there has been, particularly for Utah, some dramatic change in ranking shift. The only problem with Utah is when you're at the bottom, no matter what you do, it's pretty easy to go up and look better. This is a look at trend data over the last 20 years for teachers' salaries. So while they've made some strides in current dollars, they've essentially been flatlined in terms of purchasing power. And that gray line is essentially constant dollars for the year 2000. There is a little bit of an upward trend that you can see there, and from 08 to 10. But I think when we get the audited data for next year that we're going to find that we've lost any of that gain because of the current economic downturn and because so many teachers had salary reductions or were furloughed. So teachers are sort of just barely steady state from 1990. Now we're going to look at outputs. Graduation rates. As you look at this chart, the one thing that stands out is Nevada's not doing too well. Freshman graduation rates from 2001 to 2006, and I didn't make a chart of the trend data, but demonstrated overall downward trends in some of the Intermountain West states. The national average was pretty steady state for graduation rates between 72.5% and 75%. Likewise, in the Intermountain West region, graduation rates across 4 of the 6 states remain fairly stable, and that's reflective in this bar graph. And in the case of the 4 of the 6 states stayed relatively stable, and in the case of the other states, they remained above the national average. Colorado, Idaho, and Utah boasted freshman graduation rates higher than the national average, and New Mexico, although it was below the national average at 67.3%, saw modest gains over the past 5 years. In contrast, Arizona and Nevada's freshman graduation rates were both lower than the national average, and Nevada's average went on a slight rise from 01 to 02, but it dropped dramatically from 72% to 57% in 03-04, and then dropped again for the subsequent 2 years in 55 to 55.8%. Arizona likewise was not able to continue its upward trend, and the freshman graduation rate of 75.9% in 02-03 dropped to 66%. The next one is dropout rates. And I hate to talk about dropout rates because nobody can define dropouts. We don't have a uniform definition across the states. And one of the reform reports that was just let this last year, the Governors Association came together and said, could we just agree on a definition so that we can make comparisons and know what we're talking about? So I would say for the most part that you've got to take this with a grain of salt, but at least gives you a relationship and a trend. Idaho is the only state in the Intermountain West region that has a dropout rate that's below the national average at 4.1%. Utah is near the average with 4.2%. The remainder of the states have dropout rates that range from 5.1 in Nevada to 6.7 in Arizona. When examining the subgroups, males have higher dropout rates than females. American Indians tend to be the highest subgroup dropout rate, with having the highest subgroup dropout rate, and Asians with the lowest subgroup dropout rate. And this essentially reflects the national trends as well. There's nothing unique about the region in terms of that. Those states that have the largest subgroup dropout rates have the largest populations of those subgroups. So a question upon which to reflect, I think, is whether or not the current differentiated goals and instructional strategies that we're using with these subgroups are indeed effective to make them be able to realize state goals. Another question is that if dropout rates continue to increase, what could that tell us about the efficacy of the current construct for high schools? And I was discussing dropout rates in one of my doctoral seminars. And we're trying to diversify our doc seminars and have students from a lot of different areas. And one of our cohort members is not an educator, he's a vice president of a bank. And I love how he comes and approaches the problem because he's too new to the game to know this is the way we do things around here. And so he can bring us rather provocative thoughts. And so we were looking at the new published dropout rates for Nevada, which are pretty dismal. And so my doc students who were principals were all trying to sit around and strategize about how we could work within the system and how can we fix this to have a better holding power for students. And Michael sort of tentatively raised his hand and he goes, maybe we're asking the wrong question. He says, maybe the reason high school students are dropping out in an increasing number is because high schools are obsolete. And so it sort of turned the conversation around about, are the high schools that we essentially designed for an industrial era serving the needs of high school students who are going to have to navigate a diverse global economy? In other words, these students are not going to graduate and go to work and work in the same company for 30 years and retire. They are probably going to have 3 or 4 careers in their lifetime. How are we preparing our students for the reality of their adult life? And so I think that's sort of a provocative thought in really closely examining what are we doing in our high schools. The next thing is to look at student achievement outcomes. And so in order to really make comparisons, I looked at NAEP scores, which are normed reference tests that are done on a stratified sample of students across the country. Both reading and math assessment scores for 4th graders in the states of Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico were significantly lower than the national average and lower than most other states in the jurisdiction. 4th grade students in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico scored lower than those in 43 other states. 4th grade students in Nevada scored lower than 35 states in math. 8th graders in the region didn't fare much better, and Arizona scored lower than 33 states, and New Mexico scored lower than 41 states in 8th grade mathematics. Students scored in the same subject areas and grade levels in Colorado, Idaho, and Utah were significantly higher than or equal to the national average, and they were often significantly higher than most other state jurisdictions. So for example, only 4 states scored higher than 4th grade students in Colorado in reading. 16 states scored higher than Idaho 4th grade students in reading, and 26 states scored higher than Utah 4th graders. If we examine the input data, we can see that the states that have the lower test scores are also the same states that are challenged with providing educational opportunities for increased numbers of ELL students and students in poverty. These states are challenged to examine the effectiveness of their differentiated instructional strategies, the extent to which schools can engage their community, and the degree to which community agencies coordinate and collaborate to address the needs of children in poverty. You know, in other words, in times of scarce resources, if we can't figure out how to better coordinate and reduce redundancy across our educational and social services, then we're not using our state resources as efficiently and effectively as we could be. So, as educational policymakers in the region, I hope get together and dialogue about some of these challenges. I would offer to consider being proactive in creating future policies that support elementary and education, yet don't create an unrealistic tax burden for the working age population. And this is really critical because in two of the states, the working age population is less than the school age population. So if we don't start now in fiscally planning for how we're going to address that imbalance, then state budgets are really, really going to be distressed. The second is to create funding allocation systems that support the concept of vertical equity that I was just talking about, so that districts don't have to divert funds from one group of students to meet the needs of another group because of district inadequate resources. And that is really an issue in Nevada. And you might say, well, you know, so you take a few dollars from this kid and you put it over here, this kid who has a greater need. And so maybe that's not a big deal, but I can assure you it's a big deal to you if it's your child or your grandchild that's getting the reduction of services. And then the last thing is to develop policies that attract and hold the best and brightest of our teaching force. And I would challenge us to look at new and creative ways of doing that and to stop paying for things that don't matter. So for example, on a teacher salary scale, the number of years, the number of the time in seat, and the number of graduate credit hours that you amass contribute to your salary increases. The only problem with that is those two things have nothing to do with the productivity outcomes of districts. So why are we paying for stuff that doesn't matter? And when we were solvent, I guess that was okay to do. But in times of scarce resources and the shift in the economy change, it doesn't make any sense to me for us to continue to be doing that. Also, to consider whether or not the current construct for high schools can meet the challenge of children's needs, and I think that's a really provocative issue. And I think the first place we start there is asking the high school students. And then examining the effectiveness of differentiated instructional strategies, the extent to which schools engage their communities, as I said, and the degree to which community agencies deal with poverty. So now we're going to 2 or 3 more, okay. So now we're going to move to the complexities of funding, and I'm going to stream through this. Basically, education is a large enterprise. 1 person in 5 either attends or is employed by the nation's public school system. For all the complexities of the finance system, the policy questions are fairly simple. Who or what to fund, what amount to fund, where to get the money, and how do you share the burden across different levels of government? There are 3 overarching policies in school finance: equity, adequacy, and local district choice. It is the interaction and tension across those policies that make education finance policy so dynamic. The challenge for state policymakers is to ensure how you balance those things. And this is what happens when you don't. In Nevada, for example, Nevada has chased one goal, the equity goal. And if you look at the Education Week rankings, Nevada usually is ranked first in equity, all right? But they have ignored all of the other goals, in essence. And so basically what we have ended up with over time is distributing equal amounts of less, all right? Yes, we're one of only 5 states that have never had a court challenge because of our horizontal equity issue, all right? And that's usually what courts look at. So, however, we totally ignore in this state vertical equity. There are no funding allocation measures in the formula for either ELL, children in poverty, at risk. And so for a state that has a large amount of differentiated needs, that puts an incredible stressor on districts. All of the states in the region have a minimum foundation program, which is basically state aid equals the difference between what the state guarantees and what the district can raise in revenues. So if the state says that they're going to guarantee $8,000 per kid, and the local entity, say Clark County School District, raises $5,000 per kid from their tax base, then state aid is $3,000. They make up the difference between what your tax base can generate and what the state guarantees. And so it's a very popular program because it's fairly, as a lot of school finance people will say, it's a fairly simple program. Even state legislators can understand it. The problem is that all of these were developed in the 20s and 30s. So these models are antiquated, obsolete. Funding is not linked to state standards or goals. And so that's like making a decision to buy stock in a company, and you go talk to the CFO, and the CFO explains to you that we have this very sophisticated budgeting projection and budget process, but we don't, it doesn't have anything to do with our productivity outcomes. Well, you're running for the door. You're not buying that stock. And so it's no wonder that we can't figure out how to get from plan A to plan B, all right? Because our finance system and our goals are totally disconnected from each other. So we're driving around in this Model T trying to figure out how to navigate a global economy, and I don't think it's working for us. But we have the knowledge and tools to redesign it. The issue is, do we have the political will? And right now we have data management systems that we've never had before. We have advanced statistical procedures that we've never had available to us before that would let us develop a fairly eloquently designed system that paid for the things that mattered and distributed money out fairly to school districts. And so real quickly, these are the current expenditures for the region. And in parentheses are the rankings. As you can see, Arizona and Idaho, Nevada, Utah, we compete rigorously to be in last place. Right? It's our goal. And you can say lots of things about the spurious nature of these comparative data, but I don't care. You know, the RJ comes out every once in a while and talks about you can't compare per pupil expenditures across states, blah, blah, blah. I think all of that is really beside the point, regardless of the data sources. Do we really want to be in the bottom quartile in terms of educating our future populace? This shows you the state, local, and federal share of education. One of my favorite political commercials is the one that talks about how that Harry Reid hasn't brought our fair share of federal dollars to the state. But I think what people don't understand in terms of education is the formula to derive out federal dollars is based on your physical capacity and effort. So if you choose not to put forth effort to fund education in your state, then you are going to get a lesser amount of federal dollars than if you choose to put forth greater effort. So if you look at a state like New Mexico, which is a high effort state, their proportional share of federal dollars is much greater than Nevada, who's a high capacity but a low effort state. In other words, they have the taxing capacity. They choose not to use it to support education. Physical capacity is basically the taxpayer's ability to support governmental services. And so this is just sort of a trend analysis of our physical capacity compared to the US. So as you can see, Nevada's right around the US average. So we have taxing capacity. And then if you look at our tax burden relative, then our tax burden is not very great. And so what effort do we put forth? Essentially, I think if we looked at our priorities across the region, if we could figure out how to reprioritize to put more money into education, we may not need the number of prisons And so if you look at Nevada's prison data compared to the US average. And then just real quickly, this is going to be on the web, but these are just the different parameters that are in the funding formulas. The one thing I wanted you to notice is in Nevada, that basically when you get to special needs, Nevada funds special ed because they have to. It's the law. But if you look at the rest of the special ed needs adjustment, you see that it's blank. All right, and so Nevada, as a majority-minority student population state, that is putting incredible stress on districts to be able to adequately provide. So here are some issues. How are the overarching policy goals in school finance being balanced? And if you don't do that balance, then you're going to have problems like Nevada's experiencing today. Support levels for variables within a state's funding system are basically idiosyncratic. You can have one weight in Utah and one weight in Arizona and one weight in Nevada for the same service, and they'll be totally different. So what is the reasoning for that? How do districts address the stressors to unfunded and underfunded mandates, like no vertical equity in the formula? And how does that affect their being able to attain their accountability goals? And I think if state legislatures would take on one thing, it would dramatically help education. And that is to have a policy to not pass unfunded and underfunded mandates. Because what happens with that is administrative costs go up. We all like to bitch about administrative costs, but those unfunded mandates cause that to happen. All right. So how do states link funding principles to their accountability goals? And then what would a redesigned funding system look like? So these questions could focus a beginning discussion for collaborative dialogue in the region. And I think the region is in a unique situation because you don't have some of the entrenched institutional issues that other, eastern regions have. And so I think that could really, you could provide lighthouse leadership for the rest of the country in looking at some of these innovative ways to fund. So in summary, my recommendations would be overhaul the state funding system. It's antiquated and out of date, and I, for one, am tired of trying to drive a Model T. Link funding to state standards and school improvement efforts. In other words, pay for the things that matter. Stop legislating unfunded and underfunded mandates, and stop paying for things that don't matter, and pay for the things that impact student achievement.
Well, I want to just follow up on Teresa. Teresa's given you a lot of information, and I wanted to just talk about a couple of things that she's mentioned. And but one of the things that I would say is that politics makes, or let me put it the other way, education makes good politics. Politics makes bad education, okay? And what we see often is that, and you'll see later on in the survey, if you look at it, there's a huge amount of public support for public education. People get the idea that public education is needed, and it's fundamental to our economy, it's fundamental to democracy. What happens is that the politician uses it in a way to foster their political goals and not to address the real educational needs and goals. We're unwilling to be strategic, and I think that's what part of what Teresa is saying, is that we need to have strategic decision making. If you were to ask people, let's say, in our county, in Henderson, and if you would go down to south part of, or in Henderson, the Anthem area, Lamping School, if you ask the parents there, they would say the school is really good. And the school is really good. Where the school system is failing is the ability to deal with strategic issues for certain groups of people, especially the group that Teresa's talking about, the equity issue. And so we're unwilling to do that, and part of that is the politics of this. We're unwilling to differentiate, and we're unwilling to say to some people in the community, some people deserve more, okay, or need more than other people. that's a political question. And so a fundamental problem with education, public education, is that it works in a political world where people can't focus in on what the real issues are, or they don't want to address the real issues because they're always dealing with the politics of this. And we know how. If you ask people in education, I think people in education know how to handle some of these issues. It's not that you can't do it, it's that we don't have the willingness to do it. We don't have the desire to do it. This is not a capacity question. Teresa wants to talk about tax burden and everything. The return of investment on spending on education is pretty good in these things, especially for pre-K school children. We just don't have the willingness to do that. That's a political issue. And so we ought to recognize that. Now, one of the other things I would want to say is that while Teresa has worked at trying to say that, that the region is a good region to work on some of this, it's very clear, and when you look at Teresa's data, is that we really have two parts to our region. We have 3 states that do very well and 3 states that don't do so good. Okay, right? I mean, that's what you have. And part of that is an equity issue because of the demographics of the community and our willingness to fund education on that. And so I think it's, while I'd like to say that we can do a nice regional kind of comprehensive view of things, what we have to do is address that there are significant differences within the region based on the populations and the issues, the tax base, whatever you want to look at on that. I think that's an important part. Another issue that I think that Teresa mentioned, talked about unfunded mandates. One of the largest, and what you have, is the federal government, and this has always been a theme, I think, of Brookings about how the federal government has treated the West. Well, the federal government has treated education poorly in this, and that's the politics. They issued programs that they said were going to help people, but they never really fully funded the programs. So they've issued mandates, and it's just been a disaster because they've never really fully funded all these mandates for IEPs and whatnot. And so the states have to pick up and the local school districts have to pick up on this. Let me talk about 2 other points on this. Another point that Teresa mentioned was the foundation system. And she talked about 3 different ideas: adequacy, right, equity, and local choice. In our system of funding, there's no incentive for a local school district to do more. The incentive is to do less. So if Clark County wanted to tax itself more, all that does is release an obligation by the state to pay more. Isn't that right, Teresa? I mean,
well, in Nevada, there is a constitutional prohibition against local choice. So in Nevada, we have no local leeway. The only local revenues that school districts can get are general obligation bonds for building school construction.
Yeah, but well, that's another issue. The local choice is the politics. The state legislature won't give the school district the authority to tax. But even if they had the authority, the way the foundation works, if I were to go from $5,000 to $6,000, all that does is release the state from its obligation to fund at $8,000, let's say, in your model.
Well, actually, if it's an equalization formula, and some states there are like 5 states now that are doing 2-tiered systems.
Right.
So they'll have this foundation program on the bottom, and then they'll have a tier on top that will allow local choice. But they will bound it so it doesn't get too far afield of the equity goal, but it addresses the local choice goal. But in most states, that second tier is equalized. So what the state guarantees, instead of the per pupil expenditure in the foundation program, the state will guarantee you that if you levy a certain amount of tax rate, they will guarantee the return on that tax rate. So in other words, if I'm a rich district and I levy a tax rate and I get $5 billion, all right, and I'm a poor district and I levy a tax rate and I get $100,000, what the state will do is they will guarantee for your tax levy that you will get a minimum certain amount of return. And so in that way, they can equalize so that, so that even very poor districts that choose to tax themselves will garner a benefit just like the rich districts will.
Yeah. Let me add one more, and then we'll add another question. One of the things that is for the region an important part is that the federal government owns so much land. And so in some sense, the tax base, potential tax base isn't there because we're not taxing. The federal government doesn't pay anything in that context. So in many states where you have the potential to increase your tax base, through a variety of ways, we lose out in the West because so much of the land is public land in our states. When 87% of the land is by the federal government, we're constrained on how much we could grow our tax base.
The only tax return that we realize off that is through impact aid. So in other words, if you have military installations, then you get money for that.
Right.
You get money to offset the lack of property tax. And the same thing is if you have American Indian reservations, sovereign nations in your area, then you can get reimbursed.
Some reimbursement. Well, again, I think it's an interesting question, and it's so fundamental to us. Let me ask if there are a couple questions. I think we can take one, maybe two. It depends on how long. Yes?
Great presentation, Professor Jordan. It sounds to me like you may be suggesting that we are ripe for a lawsuit on school finance. I know that you mentioned that we're good on equity, but the issue of how the funding so heavily impacts our minority communities and our ESL communities can be the source of a federal lawsuit.
And that's an interesting question.
Is that what you're intimating in your presentation?
I'm sorry, what?
Is that what you're intimating in your presentation, perhaps?
Lawsuits are going to be difficult here, all right? There have been some things in the last few years that have helped that. Usually issues that are brought against the state constitution have to do with two things, either the due process provision of the Constitution or the education clause. Nevada, up until just very recently, had a very weak education clause. It just basically said that we should have a system of schools that are in existence at least 6 months out of the year. That's a little hard to litigate against, So recently the wording has changed, and they've entered language that has to do with preparing all children for state standards. That gives attorneys a hook that we haven't had before. And there have been several legal policy centers that have been looking at Nevada and I think are just waiting for a test case that they think would be viable.
I think we're going to, I've been given the signal. While we might have some interest in this, I think we have to call it quits, and I want to thank you for listening to Teresa and her presentation and the very nice things or good things and solid things that she had to do. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to the final session of this packed day where you've learned more than you could possibly ever thought you could know about data about the Mountain West, how it's changing demographically. We've heard about its education policy. We've heard about the role of Hispanics. We've heard about the role of millennials. And today, right now, we're going to present the results of a special survey that was done for this conference of the Intermountain West of the 6 states we've been talking about. We surveyed all 6 states. We had a 2,000-person survey. The way it broke down was we wanted to make sure we had enough people from the smaller states. So we had about 500 respondents from Colorado, 500 from Arizona, reflecting their high population weight, and then 200. We made sure we had about 250 each from the other 4 states, so we can speak with some confidence about those states as well. So let me start then by with an interesting question we asked about to our respondents. We basically asked them, what do you think about what makes it distinctive, the residents of the Mountain West? How are they different from people in the rest of the United States? Are they more likely than other Americans to be X, less likely, or about the same? So here's the results of that question. You can see the top 3 items are engage in outdoor activities and recreation. That's clearly number 1. Feel the impact of illegal immigration. Number 2, 77% said Mountain West residents were more likely to feel that impact. 75% said support the development of renewable energy sources like wind and solar. So that was 75%. And those are the top three, and we'll focus on them a little bit more as we go on. We also had 73% expressing patriotic pride, 70% volunteering, 64% as classic libertarian sentiment, feel skeptical of the federal government's power and reach. 61% said more likely to make environmental protection a top priority. 60% mentioned church-going. And then finally down here we have the one that really obviously moved the needle the least by a substantial margin, supported an emerging third political party. That was the one that didn't really resonate with people very much. So kind of keep that in mind. We'll be returning to these themes as we go on, because our survey allows us to put some of these ideas to the test, the self-image to the test, and see if it really comes out in the rest of the data of the survey, these kinds of attitudes. So with that in mind, with that as a frame, I'm going to turn it over to Carlin, who's going to talk about sort of a political portrait of people in the Mountain West and a little bit about the sort of the state of the states, some of the questions we asked in particular to state government and the state situation. And then I'll wind it up with lots of other good stuff about the environment, cultural values, the role of government, and so on.
Thank you, Rui. It's always a pleasure to be part of your tag team. I'd also like to interrupt the flow for just a moment to thank Rob and Brookings Mountain West for just a very, very stimulating day. This is a very rich survey, and I'm also very grateful that both Scott and Bill could dive deep in some areas, because Rui and I are only going to be able to skim the surface in this presentation. I want to apologize in advance because I'm going to read my notes. I'm both reeling in and reveling in data from three major surveys, another Brookings survey that was released on Wednesday where I spoke on that big data set, and I just want to make sure I get the numbers right. But Rui and I are going to tag team this and give you some of the major results overall. I'm going to start with a quick political portrait of the region. We tested views of prominent political figures.
Shall we turn to the first one here, Carl?
Okay, we can, but we're going to get to that in a minute.
There's the political portrait. That's what we're going to talk about.
Okay. Many of the results in this survey look very much like national level poll results. For example, in a question not on favorability but on Barack Obama's approval, 41% approved of the job the president was doing, while 54% disapproved, including 43% who disapproved strongly. In the late August, September ABC News Washington Post poll, the results were virtually identical, including the strong level of high disapproval.
Just in case you're confused, this is favorability, not approval.
Yeah, haven't gotten to this one yet, yes. We also asked respondents, and this is a slide that's up for you to view at this point, about favorability of a lot of different political figures. In this exercise, views of Barack Obama and George W. Bush were very similar in the Intermountain West as a whole, with Obama slightly higher on the favorable, but also slightly higher on the unfavorable. Two states, Idaho and Utah, as you can see from the slide, had the strongest negative views of the president. Next, here. Sarah Palin's overall favorability rating was 10 percentage points lower than the president's, but her unfavorable rating was identical. Only in Utah did even 4 in 10 rate her favorably. Gallup recently reported that Congress's approval rating nationally has averaged 20% this year, down from 30% in 2009, the first year of the 111th Congress. In the West, slightly more, 26% approved of the job that Congress was doing. Once again, Idaho and Utah stood out in terms of especially low levels of approval. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, as Scott Keeter highlighted, fared well in the poll overall. Despite the equally unfavorable views of the parties in Congress, Intermountain West residents are clearly leaning Republican in their party identification these days. Overall, 38% identify with or lean toward the Democrats, while 51% identify or lean toward the Republicans. They also said by 49 to 40% that they will support Republican candidates for the House of Representatives over Democratic candidates this fall. In more recent national polls, we've seen a little tightening, so these numbers might be slightly narrower than that 49-40 suggests. 3/4 of the residents were familiar with the Tea Party movement. Views of it region-wide were split evenly, as you can see from the slide. The late September to early August-September Quinnipiac national poll found roughly identical responses when the question was asked in a similar way. In a separate question in the Quinnipiac poll, 12% said that they considered themselves part of the Tea Party movement, and in the survey that was released at Brookings this week, that number was 11%. Related to the Tea Party is the issue of support for third-party candidates, and I think as Rui pointed out on that first slide, that was the lowest area in which the residents of the region felt that they were particularly distinct. The poll examined 3 of this year's hottest policy debates. After telling respondents that President Obama had signed legislation restructuring the American healthcare system in March, people in the survey were then asked whether or not they supported or opposed the new healthcare reform law. 39% did, while 55% were opposed. Opposition was particularly sharp in Idaho and Utah, where 2/3 disapproved. Only in one state, New Mexico, did support outweigh opposition. In most national polls, opposition to the new law outweighs support, though there is clearly more support nationally for reforming it than repealing it. To take Gallup's late August results, again, nearly identical to this survey, overall, in 39% approving and 56% disapproved. Negative views about the healthcare law can also be seen in another question that asks people to choose between 2 different views of the legislation. 45% regionally chose the statement that the new healthcare reform law signed by President Obama may need to be fixed, but it is an important first step in lowering costs and making affordable healthcare available to all Americans. But 52% chose the response that the new healthcare law will lead to higher taxes and massive cuts to Medicare, while doing little to rein in skyrocketing costs and must be significantly changed or repealed. In most national polls, there has been solid majority support for greater regulations of financial institutions. In the Gallup poll taken in August, 61% nationally approved of the legislation Congress passed to increase regulation of banks and financial institutions, while 37% disapproved. When asked in the Intermountain West survey whether they favored or opposed the new financial reform that, quote, increases federal regulation over banks, Wall Street investors, and other financial institutions, 52% were in favor, while 38% were opposed. Support was highest in Colorado and lowest in Utah. In the survey, people were asked whether we needed more, less, or about the same level of involvement from the federal government in addressing a number of issues. Solid majorities opted for more federal involvement on 7 of 9 issues. The largest majorities in support of more federal involvement were on immigration, followed by jobs and economic growth, stopping crimes and drugs, and promoting renewable energy. There were 2 areas where less than a majority in the Intermountain West called for more federal government involvement. One was healthcare, where just 48% called for more government involvement at the federal level, perhaps because people have either made up their minds about the healthcare law, or perhaps because they believe the situation has been addressed, or perhaps because of their awareness of the legislation's price tag. Even on this question, however, the number calling for less federal involvement was still less than the number calling for more federal involvement. This contrasts with the other item, promoting the role of faith in public life, where less than a majority wanted more government involvement. We also found, even when people were reminded, and here's the language that we use, that government is currently facing record deficits and increased spending would require larger deficit, increased taxes, or spending cuts in other areas, the public opinion needle on more federal government involvement moved very little. This suggests that the Intermountain West public interest in more government involvement in key areas is fairly robust. Although, of course, raising taxes to support increased government activity in any of these areas.
Try this one at home.
Yeah, exactly. In any of these areas would still remain a challenging political task. The state variation in the table shows some very interesting patterns. Idaho residents are clearly the least supportive of more federal government involvement. For example, only 28% wanted to see more involvement in preserving clean air and water in their areas, in 2 areas, promoting renewable energy and creating jobs and economic growth. Idaho was the only state where less than half of the public wanted to see more involvement. In contrast, Nevada residents were most likely to call for more federal government involvement. Areas where Nevada residents topped all other states in support for more involvement included dealing with illegal immigrants living here, 80%, creating jobs and economic growth, 79%, promoting renewable energy, 72%, preserving clean air, 69%, and guaranteeing a quality public education, 65%. Let me turn now to immigration. Immigration has been on the front burner for a very long time. I think we heard a great deal about the problems at the session at lunch, but it's been especially true for residents of the Intermountain West. In the survey, we asked respondents about certain characteristics that made the region distinctive. 75% said that residents of the Intermountain West were more likely to feel the impact of illegal immigration than people in other regions. Only 15% said that they were less likely to feel that impact. This was the second most important quality separating regional residents in their view from the rest of the country. The number one was engaging in outdoor activities, as Rui showed on the first slide. It should be stressed that this opinion extends beyond partisan or demographic lines and is relatively consistent, regardless of the respondents' position on how to address the immigration issue. No matter how they feel about the response to illegal immigration, they agree that residents of this region have a unique understanding of the issue because of their role on the front lines. As we see throughout this survey, the simplistic storylines that often surround the immigration issue do not match the reality in this region. Attitudes on the issue are very complex and do not reflect the rigid orthodoxy of the debate in Washington. Another question in our survey told respondents that the state of Arizona recently passed a law that gives the police the power to question anyone that they suspect is in the country illegally, requires people to produce documents verifying their status if asked, and allows officers to detain anyone who cannot do so. When asked whether this law goes too far in dealing with the issue of illegal immigration, doesn't go far enough, or is about right, 36% regionally said that it went too far, 45% said that it was about right, and 17% not far enough. In May and July, CBS News asked a virtually identical question, and again, the results were remarkably similar to the results in this poll overall. In the question series on more or less or the same level of federal involvement in various issues that was described earlier, the two largest majorities in favor of more government involvement were on stopping the flow of illegal immigrants across the border, 74%, and dealing with millions of illegal immigrants already here, 69%. This suggests the depth of concern about immigration in these states. National polls show that most Americans believe dealing with immigration is a national issue. But they also tell pollsters that Arizona was right to act in the absence of federal government action. When asked in a separate question in this survey whether their state government should be doing more to stop the flow of illegal immigrants across the border, again focusing on state government, 63% of respondents said yes. As for dealing with those already here, a similar number, 62%, said that they wanted their state government more involved. Two pairs of statements in the survey probed attitudes about immigrants and about immigration reform. Regionally, 52% chose the statement, as they have for generation, immigrants today continue to enrich our culture and strengthen our economy, while 40% viewed immigrants today as a burden on our country because they take jobs and use government benefits. There were only small differences on this question by state. Arizonans, for example, split 54-39% on this question. Most Americans are not punitive in their views about immigration, except perhaps, as David suggested at lunch, that they want to punish employers. And this was also true in the Intermountain West, despite high levels of concern about the issue. In this poll, 58% chose the statement that illegal immigrants who have been living and working in the United States for years and who do not have a criminal record, whoops, there we go.
No, actually, no, this is
where we want.
There we go.
And who do not have a criminal record should be allowed to start on a path to citizenship by registering that they are in the country, paying a fine, getting fingerprinted, and learning English. 38% endorsed the other statement that there should be no amnesty, social services, or other benefits given to illegal immigrants who have broken laws of our country by coming here illegally in the first place. Views are remarkably similar across states in the region. Let me turn very briefly to the state of the states. People are usually more optimistic about conditions in their states than they are about national level conditions, and the responses in our survey followed this pattern. The right track, wrong track question was asked for the first time in the early 1970s by the Roper Organization. In most years, in national surveys, when the question's been asked, the country has been heading in the wrong direction. The level of national pessimism reflected in this question today is toward the high end of that usually negative response, and it is mirrored in the states we surveyed. Only a quarter thought things in the country were on the right track, while 2/3 said that they were going in the wrong direction. Those results are very similar to current national level responses. Residents of the Intermountain West were more optimistic about their states, as this slide shows, than the nation as a whole, but they could hardly be described as enthusiastic. Just 37% said things in their state were going in the right direction, while 54% said that they had gotten seriously off on the wrong track. In terms of state-level differences, this question produced some stark differences, with the level of pessimism in Nevada far surpassing any of the other states in the region. In contrast, Utah residents were actually more optimistic than pessimistic. Views of adults in Nevada about the performance of their governor were much more negative than were views about the adults in other states. Utah, Idaho, and Arizona gave their governors solid majority approval. The latter finding, I think, is particularly striking since Arizona residents were also so pessimistic about the direction of their state. The verdict on the economic stimulus proposal passed in 2009 was decidedly negative in the Intermountain West. Just 37% of residents there believed that the stimulus plan had, quote, helped avert an even greater economic crisis and is making investments that will ultimately help create jobs and economic growth, while 59% said that it had produced few jobs and wasted billions of taxpayer dollars, increasing the deficit overall. In our survey, respondents were asked to rate policy priorities for their state on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 was extremely important and 0 not important at all. Given widespread economic pessimism, it's hardly surprising that creating new jobs and economic growth was the top issue people in this region, and also in 5 of the 6 states, wanted their elected officials to address. Overall, this issue received a mean rating of 8.7%, with 69% giving it a very high rating of 9 or 10. Second overall, and in 4 of the 6 states, was improving state schools, a mean rating of 8.5, 62% at the 9.10 level. And third was fighting crime. Also rated highly were reducing federal government spending, reducing illegal immigration, moral decline, protecting the environment. Reducing taxes, limiting federal government power, and promoting alternative energy sources were less highly rated, and by far the least highly rated was congestion and overdevelopment. The latter finding is perhaps surprising given the high profile this issue has had in a lot of campaigns. In this survey, people were asked whether they felt the need to do more, the need for more, less, or about the same level of involvement from their state government in addressing a number of issues. These questions exactly paralleled the series of questions we asked about more, less, or the same amount of federal government involvement. Solid majorities opted for more state government involvement on 7 of the 9 issues, the same pattern we observed in the federal government series. But there were some important differences. One was that support for more state government involvement was somewhat stronger in most areas than support for more federal government involvement, though of course that was already fairly high. Another was that the largest majorities in support of more state involvement were on jobs and economic growth and on guaranteeing a quality publication rather than immigration issues. In addition, promoting renewable energy resources and cracking down on crime and drugs also ranked higher on more involvement than immigration issues overall. As with the federal government series, there were 2 areas where less than a majority in the Intermountain West called for more federal and government, more involvement by their state government. One was healthcare, we talked about that earlier, where 49% called for more state involvement. But the number calling for less state involvement, 29%, was still less than the number calling for more involvement. Far below healthcare was promoting the role of faith in our public life. Here, just 23% in the region wanted more state government involvement, compared to 50% who wanted less. We also found that even when people were reminded, and here's the wording we use, that the state has been forced to make significant cuts in the state's budgets due to economic conditions, and government is currently facing record deficits, and increased spending would require more taxes or spending cuts in other areas. The public opinion needle, once again, about more state government involvement moved only modestly. This suggests that the Intermountain West's public interest in more state government involvement in key issues is strong and not easily shaken. Again, raising taxes to support increased government activity in any of these areas would still remain a challenging political task for governors and legislators. It's clear from this survey that residents of the Intermountain West want Washington and their states to do many things, none of which can be accomplished easily or inexpensively. That may explain the only middling level of concern about taxes, despite the region's reputation for anti-tax sentiment. Several other results from this survey bear on the issue of taxes. And now I'm going to turn it back to Rui.
We'll get to them in just a second. First, we want to talk a little bit about the environmental ethos of the Intermountain West. As you recall from the first slide, this is what the people in the Mountain West believe is a very distinctive aspect of the region, this commitment to outdoors, to alternative energy, to the environment, and so on. So they talk the talk, do they walk the walk? Well, we'll see. This is a slide that summarizes those three questions. 85% overall on outdoor recreation, 75% on sporting development of renewable energy sources, 61% environmental protection of high priority. These are distinctive aspects in people's view of the Mountain West, and you can see the variation by state, which is considerable, but in most, pretty much all cases, it's a majority or above. Interesting to look at Colorado. The Coloradans, I think, have a self-image of being very into this stuff, and certainly borne out by how emphatically they answered these questions. And we'll get to there in a second to talk a little bit about what the content of that is. But I just want to kind of carry it back to something that is in our paper, but I don't think was mentioned in the talk. Coloradans give these astronomically high levels to these things they say that are distinctive of the Colorado state and of the area. But when we asked them how high the environment should be as a priority in their state, they didn't really rank it any higher than anybody else. So that's the case maybe of talking the talk, not quite walking the walk. So I hope I haven't offended anyone here from Colorado, but I just thought the truth must come out. We need to point that out. Okay, this is, we asked people about climate change. Is it a real threat? Is it really happening? Or is it just a theory that remains to be proved? We found a slight majority in favor of that it's a real threat, but that does vary considerably by state. It's highest, interestingly enough, being viewed as a real threat in Arizona. Wouldn't have guessed that necessarily, I suppose. And it's lowest, you would have guessed this, in Idaho and Utah, where clear majorities reject the idea that it's a real threat and tend to more think it's kind of a theory. So we have some skeptics running around on this issue in the Intermountain West. They don't want to shock you, but there it is. Now, this is something that really does more comport with the self-image of people in the Mountain West. What's people's view on what's the best way to approach the energy issue? Are we better off investing in wind and solar energy, solutions to produce clean energy, jobs over the long term? Or are we better off investing in proven technologies like clean coal, nuclear energy, which will pay off right away? So we asked that question. We got 64% choosing the alternative energy path, only 30% choosing the sort of more conventional technology path. And it didn't, it varied by state. Clearly, it's highest in New Mexico, lowest in Utah. But in no case was there anything other than a thumping majority in favor of the alternative energy path. So here's an example where all states, the region seems to be marching in step on this issue. It does seem somewhat consistent with their self-image, comports well with it. But let's go on from that to talk a little bit about political ideology and the views about government, about what its proper role is. Now, we asked the ideology question. We asked an ideology question, very common in a political survey of any kind. We asked it a little bit differently than you normally do. We gave people more choices. It's free to choose. It's kind of the Milton Friedman approach to the question. So we gave people progressive, liberal, libertarian, and conservative as the four choices that they could take. And then if they said they were moderate, we pushed them a little bit and said, well, if you had to choose, which one would you choose? And in fact, if you did that, almost everybody who said they were a moderate eventually fessed up to having some sort of a point of view. And what we found is 48% of people in the region say they're conservative, 22% said liberal, 16% progressive. So altogether, liberal and progressive, about 38%. Now, we actually did this recently at the Center for American Progress. We used the same scale in a national survey, and these results do differ a little bit. I think conservative was 42% nationally, and the liberal progressive together was 40%. So clearly a somewhat more conservative leaning ideological distribution here, though the amount of libertarians was about the same. In other words, no greater proportion of libertarians here self-professed, despite the sort of reputation of the Mountain West. This is a question that allows us to sort of test directly and substantively some of these kind of libertarian sentiments, your views about the role of government. We asked, which do you agree with more? Should government promote economic opportunity, provide minimum levels of economic security, or should the government strictly limit its role in individuals' lives, just basically leave them alone, let them make their own mistakes, get out of the way? So we found we got a pretty much exact split there. 47% chose a more pro-government statement, 48% chose this more libertarian sentiment. The clear winner on the libertarian side is in Utah, where 60% endorse the libertarian conception, only 34% the more active government kind of thing. However, let's put that in context and put that together with some of the rest of the findings in the survey. You know, half of the people say, you know, we should have this sort of libertarian approach to government, but these are, many of them, the same people who said they want more federal government involvement in schools and the renewable energy and so on, obviously dealing with an issue like immigration. They want more federal involvement, more state government involvement, especially in schools and jobs and economic growth and so on. We found that these are the same people who, we found it basically in the survey that people were for government regulation of the financial system. Therefore, in general, the idea government has a role to play in regulating business, acting as a check on business rather than just stifles innovation when it tries to regulate. So these libertarian sentiments are a little bit belied or at least complicated by some of these other findings. And you know, finally, to hark back to something Carlin was talking about, we found when we pushed people on, you say you want, you know, more, we split sampled it, so some people asked, just more involvement in state government, just more involvement in federal government, and other people were asked with the preamble about, well, you know, if we have more federal involvement, you know, it could mean more, you know, cut spending in other areas, increase taxes, and so on, which didn't move the needle much. So again, it suggests that kind of uneasy coexistence between these different elements of views toward government in the Mountain West. And let me kind of punctuate that or underscore it by looking at several of our results, particularly on taxes, which are kind of interesting and I think, again, complicate this sort of libertarian picture of the Mountain West. We asked people, well, which you agree with more? I don't mind paying the federal taxes because we each have a responsibility to contribute to the common good and support people who need it. Or I don't like paying federal taxes because the damn government, damn wasn't in there, in Washington basically wastes all our money, it's inefficient and all that stuff. And we found that by 53 to 40%, people endorsed the don't mind paying federal taxes kind of notion. And even more interesting, we don't see that huge a spread across the states. There's a majority or plurality in favor of the first statement about having a responsibility to contribute to the common good over the other more libertarian statement about taxes, which is, again, is kind of interesting in light of these other findings. And then we also asked people a classic question that's been asked many times. Do you think your federal taxes are too high, about right, or too little? No, hardly anybody ever says too little. So the distribution is really between too high and about right. We found only 41%, and really that's low for this kind of a question, saying it was too high. 53% said, about right, you know, about right. And interesting to get that response during the recession. It's interesting to get that response in this sort of area where, again, has a bit of a libertarian reputation. And we found that in every state, again, there's a majority or plurality in favor of the idea that we do have a responsibility to pay our federal taxes, and therefore I don't mind it as much as I otherwise would. So that is kind of interesting. Now, it's complicated even a little further, though. People don't feel quite as warm and fuzzy about their property taxes. We got about right, it's kind of truncated there in the title, but 46% said their property taxes were about right, 43% too high. So a much more even split. And you had some states like Arizona, for example, and particularly Utah, where they're just mad as hornets about their property taxes. So it does get a bit complicated when you get close to the ground level. Now let's talk a little bit about cultural and social issues. First of all, you know, I don't know if anyone's packing here in the audience, but if you are and you feel at any rate you have the right to pack a gun, you're in good company, because all across the Mountain West, people agree that our Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms are under direct threat in this country today. This shows you the agree and also the strongly agree. So 64% people in the region agreed with this statement that the rights of Americans to pack a gun are under attack. And it was true in every state. Up to a high of 77%, interesting, in New Mexico, a low of 57%, Colorado, and you got a big strongly agree component in all states. So people are kind of down with this idea that basically the government will pry my gun out of my cold, dead hand, something like that. Now, we also looked at same-sex marriage, of course, a real hot-button issue still culturally, though perhaps not as hot as it once was. We find a 43-49 split between people who said same-sex marriages should be or should not be recognized by law with the same rights as traditional marriages. That's pretty close to what we get now in the national distribution. We did see some variation by state, of course. We got people in Colorado basically favoring same-sex marriage, and we have a plurality in Nevada as well. So some considerable state variation on this issue. Finally, should women be staying at home and taking care of the household if they're at all financially able to do so? Well, most people don't agree with that, though that's not true in Idaho, where 53% agree that, in fact, the little lady should stay home and take care of the household. 61% in Utah, so they're really pretty different than the other states here, which is obviously, of course, a common pattern. These are the most conservative states, particularly on cultural issues. 103% in Utah?
103% agree or strongly disagree that women...
No. The strongly agree is included in the agree bar.
subset.
It's not as crazy as you think.
No.
So I'm sorry, I should have pointed that out. It means 44% total agree, 25% points of that, okay, are strongly agree. So don't add these together. No. Very bad. Okay, so let me just offer some concluding remarks to kind of tie in this survey to some of the stuff we've talked about all day about demographic change and how it's affecting the area. We've heard a lot about it today in all kinds of different varieties. We heard, in fact, in terms of this particular survey earlier, the kind of particular views of millennials and Hispanics and how they differ from the population as a whole in the Mountain West. And I want to just say a word or two about how it might intersect these public opinions we measured in this survey with the ongoing process of demographic change, in particular the kind of key segments that Bill Fry and I talked about in the first presentation today: white college graduates, the white working class, and minority residents. How is that kind of fall out in terms of some of these views, and it's measured in the survey? Well, in sort of very broad brush, here's what we found. If you look at questions about government involvement, state government involvement, minorities are much more likely than either white college graduates or the white working class to be for such involvement. We find that white college graduates are more in favor of government regulation than the white working class, and minorities are more favorable still. We find, in terms of a favorable attitude toward immigrants or support for a path to citizenship, that white college graduates and, of course, minorities are actually quite positive about this, and white working class considerably less so, bordering on negative. We find, in terms of taxes, that sort of a more benign attitude toward taxes, of feeling like they're for the common good. My federal taxes are about right, and so on, kind of measures of tax sensitivity, much higher among the white working class than among white college graduates and minorities. We find, in terms of gay marriage, that the most hostile attitudes toward gay marriage are among the white working class, and that actually minorities, is primarily Hispanics, and white college graduates are actually pretty similar. They're about split down the middle on gay marriage at this point in the Intermountain West. And we also found that free trade is another example. We didn't discuss this question much, but we did ask a question like, and we find white college graduates, very consistent with other data, are very much in favor of free trade. The white working class, far less so, and minorities are kind of in the middle. So what does that all add up to? Well, let me read you a list of things I think it adds up to in terms of the effect of demographic change going forward. The effect of, just to remind you of what's happening here, over time, we'll have a drop of basically half a percentage point a year in almost in all the at least half a percentage point a year in the white working class in all states in the Intermountain West, except in Nevada here, it's a percentage point a year. That's per year. And their place is being taken by mostly minorities, but also by a good chunk of white college graduates. So that's how the mix is changing over time. If that mix continues to change in the way that I just alluded to, we can, I think, fairly reliably predict that the public opinions of people in the Intermountain West are going to be affected in the following way. And this doesn't say anything about elections and who's going to be able to get elected to office, that sort of thing. We're just talking about people's public opinions. Elections are more complicated, though we can obviously get into it. We're going to see more support for government involvement in most areas, especially education, renewable energy, the environment, and healthcare, and probably for government regulation. We're going to see less tax sensitivity. We're going to see a warmer attitude toward immigrants and a path to citizenship for illegals. Again, solving that problem at the policy legislative level, very complicated, but at any rate, a warmer attitude. We're going to see more support for free trade. And we should see less support for socially conservative positions like opposing gay marriage. And again, to bring it back to Scott Keeter's presentation, all of that gets reinforced by the generational changes that are going forward, because pretty much across the board, the younger generation skews in the sort of policy direction that I've just been been outlining. So what does that all mean going forward? It means that the environment is going to look pretty different over time. I mean, it's already changed a lot as we've documented in the last 20 years. It's going to change still more in the future. That political train, as it shifts, is something that the political parties are going to have to respond to. And that includes all of them, not just the Democrats, but the Republicans as well. I think Rob was alluding to that very eloquently earlier today. And that they're going to have to do it, and to the extent they try to still organize and promulgate their politics on the basis of the Intermountain West, the image they have of it in their mind's eye, their view of the way it was, maybe not even today, but in the past, I think the more they're going to be out of step with going on. If you really want to connect to people politically, it just makes sense. You have to kind of keep track of that moving target. You have to adapt to the way the population is changing. You can't be like Bertolt Brecht once said about the communists. You dissolve the people and elect another. You can't do that. You're stuck with the people you got, and you've got to respond to them. So I'll just leave it there, and I think Ron might have a few words to say.
So I'm supposed to offer us a few comments on it, and then maybe turn it over to the audience for questions. First of all, I'd say that I always think of Carlin and Roy as the Hepburn and Tracy of political demography, in that they are two consummate professionals, or even better together. But I want to kind of offer a couple thoughts that, again, looking at electoral history, that leave some questions in my mind about whether the tolerance of activist government, particularly at the federal level, in practice in the West, is as strong as the survey would suggest. And I want to kind of start off with 3 data points for you of kind of the political distribution of power across this entire region. The 6 states you guys poll, plus Wyoming and Montana, the 8 states of the Mountain West. If you think back, again, kind of as I was doing lunch, think of history here for a minute. In the 70s and 80s, the West produced some of the most distinctive and kind of iconoclastic Democrats in the national firmament. There was Gary Hart, Tim Wirth, Dick Lamb, Roy Romer in Colorado, Bruce Babbitt, Scott Matheson in Utah. There was a whole crop of them. And in fact, in 1993, after the 92 election, when Bill Clinton took office, Democrats held 5 of the 8 governorships, 6 of the 16 Senate seats, and 11 of the 24 House seats across the Mountain West region. Under Clinton, the Republicans made a significant resurgence, particularly in that election of 94, and Democrats reached their low point in the 2000 election in the Mountain West region. George Bush carried all of the 8 states except New Mexico. He won a cumulative 58% of the vote across the entire Mountain West. And at that point, after that election, Republicans held all 8 governorships, 13 of the 16 Senate seats, and 3/4 of the region's House seats. So in the 90s, the Democrats really were pushed back and saw their position substantially erode while they held the White House. Now, in this decade, the tide turned again. And as of 2008, Barack Obama, in the 2008 election, Obama won 3 of the states in the region, came close in another. He won 48.5% of its vote, cumulatively, compared to 42% in 2000. After the 2008 election, Democrats now were back to the point of holding 17 of the 28 House seats, 5 of the 8 governorships, and 7 of the 16 Senate seats. And by the way, exactly half of the state legislative chambers. Now, the forces that brought the Democrats back in this decade are really the ones, above all, I think, that you have heard discussed today. A growing minority share of the vote across these states, a realignment in their direction among upper middle class white suburbanites, white collar whites, and growing urbanization, suburbanization, and density. The West was not immune. It turned out to be later, but not immune to what I have described as the class inversion in American politics, which we're all living through, which is that as compared to the New Deal era, the first decades after the New Deal, where you could draw a line somewhere in the income ladder, and Republicans did best among people above it, and Democrats did best among people below it. That began to change in the 60s, and we are now living in a world where the cornerstone of the Republican majority are working class white voters, or the Republican coalition are working class white voters without a college education, and Democrats are running increasingly better among upper middle class whites with a college education. We saw this flip suburbs outside of Philadelphia, New Jersey, Chicago, along the East Coast and the West Coast in the 90s, By 2008, this had reached the Mountain West, and the great signifier or signal of that were the Denver suburbs, Arapahoe and Jefferson. No Democrat had carried them since Lyndon Johnson in 1964. John Kerry got close. Barack Obama won them. Mark Udall won them. Bill Ritter won them. And that is what has brought Democrats from a position of being marginalized in the Mountain West to being very competitive. The same forces that really have changed their position elsewhere. As we saw earlier this morning, the share of the electorate on a national basis, the share of the vote cast by non-whites has doubled from 13% when Bill Clinton won to 26% when Barack Obama won. Obama only won 43% of the white vote in the country and won the most decisive Democratic victory since Lyndon Johnson. And the West has been caught up in that. But I think if you look at this history, it raises the question of whether there is something else going on in the West. And that is, as I said, the Democrats eroded substantially when Clinton was here, when Clinton was in the White House, and especially in 93 and 94, when Democrats held unified control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. They lost ground electorally in the West. And by all signs, 2010 offers a very similar outcome, where you have a unified Democrat control in Washington, the House, the Senate, and the White House, advancing a national Democratic agenda, and clear evidence of a backlash in the West. As the poll showed, nearly 60% oppose the health care law across the region, and nearly 60% view the stimulus plan as a failure. And then you didn't even poll Montana and Wyoming, which might have pushed it even further in that direction. So the question I find myself wondering is, there is no doubt that the basic demographic evolution of the West, of the Mountain West, pushes it in a direction that should be more favorable to Democrats over time. As the non-white population grows, as the upper middle class white college-educated population grows, and as those voters have generally trended toward Democrats. But it is not clear to me that Democrats can govern in Washington and advance a national Democratic agenda and maintain the support of even the bare minimum number of whites you need in order to win in these states. And I think you are seeing in this election, I think you will see in this election a very clear sign of that. If you look nationally at the white electorate today, Barack Obama's approval rating is roughly 35% or below among white men without a college education, white women without a college education, and white men with a college education. The only portion of the white electorate right now that is open to Democrats are college-educated white women. Obama is still at 51 among them in Gallup this week, and the Democrats are at 51 among them in Gallup's generic congressional ballot. So the question I would ask, and maybe the way to start this, Roy, you ended up with a very positive, your basic conclusion was that the region will evolve, and then I'll turn it over to you guys for questions, but your ending was basically that the region is going to increasingly adopt positions that will be held by Democratic candidates, not by Republican candidates. And those are, every one you listed was something that almost no Republican candidate, the way the party is evolving, will hold. And the implication of that should be that they should be more open to Democratic candidates. And I guess I am wondering, when you look at what happened under Clinton and when you look at what may be happening now under Obama with unified control, is it easier for Democratic candidates to position themselves as moderates in the West when a Republican is in the White House than it is when a Democrat is in the White House? And are they identified with the Democratic Party in a way that they cannot, a national Democratic agenda in a way that makes it hard to win out here?
Well, I guess I would argue that the two situations are a little bit different. I mean, in the sort of the post-Clinton backlash kind of thing was really to some extent a consolidation of sort of the regrouping of the white working class behind the Republican banner. So in a way, nothing absolutely terrible had to happen for the country as a whole for that backlash to occur. Now, the backlash that's occurring today, you could argue, is so heavily driven by the economy. How terrible the economy is. In other words, is Obama doing as poorly as he is, and are Democrats going to do as poorly as they are because the National Democrats have implemented an agenda and people are just up in arms? That might be part of it, or is it primarily driven by heavy discontent with the way the country has gone in terms of being on the wrong track, in terms of the unemployment being at 9.6, this sense of we're just not gaining traction economically. People are hurting, they're suffering, they're frustrated, and they're punishing the incumbent party. I mean, the test of this will be if the economy does come back to a, you know, in a reasonable degree, a substantial degree by 2012, and these voters don't snap back in the Mountain West, that would definitely tell us something, be consistent with your theory. On the other hand, if they do snap back to the Democrats, I mean, go back to the Democrats, then that would tell you something about how soft the current move is and how sort of these basic structural tendencies are working their way out.
Carlin, before you jump in, I would just say in response, I believe both things are going on. I do not believe there is a majority that is ideologically recoiling nationally from what Obama has done. I do believe there is a big, obviously, there's much as there was under Clinton when they called the Labor Alone Coalition, there's a big, roughly low 40% of the electorate that is ideologically recoiling, and when you add that to the last 15 or 17% that is just unhappy with the way things are, I think you're right. That's when you get up to the really big numbers that we are seeing. But the question is, in a place like in these kinds of states, is there a resistance to federal activism as we've seen it expressed both in 93, 94, and 09, 10 that may be greater than some of that data suggests?
I think what there is a resistance to a cumulative package of extraordinary federal government involvement, most of which Americans supported when they were first asked about it. They supported TARP initially, they turned against it by December. They supported the stimulus initially, they turned against it very quickly. They supported the auto bailout from the get-go. And I think it's the cumulative impact of those role of government issues where Washington seems very out of touch, and particularly Democrats in Congress and the president, that's really driving this electorate, though we can't underestimate the economy.
Folks, some questions from you guys? Yeah.
How much do you think your question about the environment and renewable energy was driven by daily images of oil spewing into the Gulf?
I gotta believe that had something to do with it. On the other hand, I bet if you'd asked it before this happened, you probably still would have gotten a fairly healthy majority, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's up. This is speculative from what it would have been prior to that event. I do think I mean, we know from the polling data it's changed some people's minds. For example, if you ask people about drilling, there's still, in some polls, a majority in support of more drilling, but it's much less than it used to be, so it has had an effect.
Yes.
I'm curious how you view the change in attitudes over the period of time that you're talking about might have to do with news organizations behaving like soap operas and Twitter being a major way that people are learning about what somebody else thinks is going on.
If you're asking me, I mean, I think that the most important thing we're seeing in the media is more people choosing to consume media that basically reinforces what they believe, and the kind of the resurgence really, since the first time since the early 20th century of overtly partisan media to the extent that we have, and it is one of many forces that kind of encourage a polarization between the parties, more ideological homogenization. Part of what happens, I believe, part of what is happening, I believe, is that we have kind of a feedback loop in which all issues are presented to the country, and Carlin, this is, I think, the answer to your question of why the numbers change so fast. There's almost no issue that doesn't come to the country now absent a partisan lens, with all the elected officials on one side supporting it and all the elected officials on the other opposing it. Each incoming president's approval rating among voters in the opposite party has declined faster than the one before. And so, Bush is down to 20% among Democrats, and, except for 9/11 in 6 months, and Obama's down to 20% among Republicans in, 4 months and 3 months or days. And once that happens, it's very hard for any elected Republican to stand with him on a big issue. And then once that happens, the way the issue is presented to the country is through every Republican here, every Democrat is here. You see in public opinion, you see people lining up. The percentage of Republicans who believe global warming is happening is dropping like a stone. And once that happens, it just kind of feeds into the kind of the separation. So yeah, I think that is a big factor. I don't think it's the only factor. I think it's just contributing to a kind of a wheel that's going on. But I think it is the kind of the profound question I find myself asking with Obama following Bush following Clinton is whether anybody can any longer be president of more than half the country.
There was a wonderful line in a recent Pew survey in the analysis of a big survey on how people were faring economically, in which they said, these are just simply different realities that Democrats and Republicans appear to be living if you look at the data. And that's clearly being reinforced by the media, no question.
Well, one more question? Okay. We have another question here?
Yeah, over here.
Over there? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Your data presented an interesting comparison when you went and provided 4 options for respondents instead of Democrat or Republican, instead of conservative or liberal. You presented progressive, which I'll call socialist, liberal as being the traditional liberal view, libertarian and conservative. To what extent are the old labels falling apart? Because it seems to me that in the West we have this coexisting view of things that don't fit one party or another. They kind of cross over. To what extent are your labels not working?
Well, labels don't work very well, for sure. They haven't for a long time. I mean, if you just ask conservative, moderate, liberal, for example, that actually doesn't change very much over time. But how you interpret it is always difficult, because a lot of people who call themselves moderates are really just people you'd probably call liberals if they wanted to call themselves but they choose to call themselves moderates. So the ideological distribution is always a little bit different than it looks just from looking at liberal, conservative, moderate. But it does, the very fact of that confusion, and that there are a lot of people who call themselves conservative aren't nearly as conservative. A lot of other people call themselves conservative, that there's differentiation within the ranks. It's very hard to capture with a 3-point question. With 4 points or 5 points, it's a little bit easier. And it does reflect the fact that things aren't as neatly packaged as they once were in terms of people's self-professed ideology. And there's more work to be done and more forms of this question that probably can and should be asked to plumb that in any depth. So, I share your frustration, and all we can do is report to you the data that we have. Though, I mean, your comment about progressive doesn't mean socialist to people. I should just point that out. That is not the case.
The environmental aspect combined with the Second Amendment aspect was a perfect example of conflicting views that coexist within the population concurrently. It's very difficult for the political entities to understand.
Well, the studies that have been done, I mean, Carlin can speak to this, but very quickly, Pew and others have looked at how many people who call themselves conservative or liberal are consistently conservative or liberal as we identify it across foreign policy, cultural, and role of government. And the answer is not that many. On the other hand, in the political system itself, the consistency is growing, and especially, I think, more so in the Republican Party than even in the Democratic Party. But we talk about kind of the libertarian thrust, for example, of this year's class of Tea Party candidates and challengers. It just doesn't really exist in the sense that they are social conservatives. They're, as I was talking about before, the 21 Republican Senate challengers with a serious chance of winning. The only ones who are not pro-life are Mark Kirk and Linda McMahon. All the others, no matter how libertarian they are, they oppose abortion, even and here, I think, rape, incest, and life of the mother. So what you're getting from the supply side may be different than what people are looking for from the demand side, but the supply side offerings have increasing ideological consistency, not only within the individual, but within the party as a whole.
Well, I think another way of putting that, there's more ideological cohesion among candidates than there is actually among
voters
who tend to have more mixed and complicated views.
Okay.
Okay.
I just want to wrap this up. Can you hear me? I want to wrap this up. I want to thank everybody who came and participated, showed up, put the event on. There were a lot of people behind the scenes. Becky Bolton back there, thanks especially. And I want to tell you what we're going to do with this. This is the last housekeeping note. One, we've captured this all on film. So we'll figure out a way to get this onto the internet, probably through YouTube and some link on our website, some way or another. The other thing is that we're going to take these articles, there's 6 of them, and put them in a compilation and put them out through the Brookings Institution Press, and we have to decide who's editor. Looks like you're editor. And I decided that that's a command decision. No.
Sir, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. All kidding aside. So this will come out and be captured, and the important thing is that, we'll get it out ahead of the 2012 election. What's key is that we're going to have this election. So some of these questions that we've raised here today are going to be answered. There's going to be a large Republican presence, probably the House, maybe the Senate, more remotely the Senate. But what does that mean in terms of baseline figures going into the next election? in the case of '06, those midterm gains translated into continuous momentum, and eventually the Democrats who gained in '06 in the midterms took the White House. Are you setting up for the same kind of change? Is there a reverse movement when people see an improvement in the economy and that part of the population that is just plain served? And you see that, by the way, the Nevada numbers are startling. You have, it may be, I don't know, we haven't polled every state. Maybe Michigan feels this way. But it's probably the state with perhaps the most anger about the direction things are going in. Does that abate when things get better? Do they get better? So all of this is sort of, what we'll set up in that book, and that'll serve as a resource, and it's the never-ending story, Then, of course, the next round of data is we have the 2012 election. So thanks for showing up here. We're going to continue political analysis like this from the Brookings Mountain West. We'll continue to issue reports like this, and we'll issue a report post this election. In other words, we'll look at these states and get a fast read on where they went within this election and issue some kind of, analysis that captures that. And importantly, we'll issue reports related to and leading up to the 2012 presidential election. And I thank you very much for attending, and have a nice day. It's beautiful outside. That's why I love you.